I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Lydia Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello and welcome to Arcane Mark, Design Diaries, Designing Incentives.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about incentives. What are the kinds of actions that your system encourages players to do or to not do?
And this is a distinct episode from GM Tools about rewards, about giving out rewards to players. This is not going to be about, like, how would a GM design a cool reward that is tailor-fit to what the player wants. However, rewards are a type of incentive. But, like Linda was saying, the way that the system gives you results to your checks and to your decisions that you make are also a very important type of incentive. And as this is a design diary, we're going to get very analytical and look to see what types of behaviors that the system is encouraging players and characters to have. And this will include some types of incentives that are a type of reward. Like, for example, we'll talk a little bit about experience points and gold economies, which are part of an incentive structure.
So we can talk about some of the things that sort of fall into that category of numbers go up.
Yes,
that's one of the major categories where you have it in terms of like earning experience points, like having a tally that goes up. Sometimes numbers that go up represent a way that your character is becoming mechanically more powerful, or is having access to additional opportunities. And sometimes numbers that go up are more about like bragging rights in some sort of way,
exactly.
Just feeling cool.
So when we're talking about experience points, in many games that have them, they are fundamentally crucial towards the character's main advancement mechanically, because they usually give you a level or the ability to buy more abilities in level-less systems. And they are one of the most fundamental incentives you can give. Therefore, it's very important to decide and determine where and when you give experience points and how much. For example, in a recent Roll for Combat Live episode, we were talking about, Steven was talking about Baldur's Gate 3, and we were talking about design decisions they made and how you can use them as a GM in your own game. And one of the things was talking about like a peaceful or like a non-violent solutions at still giving you XP. But the problem was some people who had played Baldur's Gate 3 said that they still do, and they give you a lot of XP, but if you count it up, it's way less than if you had done a violent solution. So in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, very explicitly, if there's something in your way that is an obstacle, or that like the encounter is something you would have had to get through, no matter how you solve it, whether you fight, whether you talk your way through, whether you literally sneak past, assuming that you've fully dealt with that threat, and if you sneak past but they're still around and then they attack you from behind later, you've not necessarily fully dealt with it yet.
But if you sneak past and then like you're able to solve the problem, and then that encounter is not something that you then need to do in the future, because you leave.
Then you've completely solved that. You bypassed it, but you solved it. Even if you didn't even have to roll a sneak check because you found another route through the dungeon that didn't go to the room with those guardians because you found secret doors they didn't know about. You get the XP in Pathfinder 2nd Edition for any solution.
And if you don't, then the system is going to incentivize,
whatever solution gives
the XP. So, for example, you might have a situation where players are like, well, I think it would be interesting to go for a diplomatic solution, but if we go for diplomatic solutions instead of violent solutions, then our characters are going to be weaker because we did those kinds of things. Or, that also creates an incentive for the GM to spend less time on the things that don't give XP because they don't count toward leveling up the characters. So then the GMs are like, okay, yeah, well, if people have a session and they're not really gaining XP, then they may not like that. And I'm going to need to create more content because this content isn't going to contribute toward that part of the story.
That's right.
Having things like, XP for however you get past the situation, and accomplishment XP for for getting certain challenges that never had a potential to beat combat are important for establishing what you want the game to do. And if you have a situation where different solutions give more XP than others, like you were saying, Mark, then it incentivizes saying that the solution that gives the most XP is, like, in some way the best solution. And sure, you can have situations where players are like, okay, yeah, this other thing may have given more XP, but the solution that we chose was, like, more of the right thing to do. So we feel like, our characters sacrifice some power in order to do this. And, like, in small doses, that kind of thing can work. But as a general system setting, that can create tension between what the players want and what the system encourages.
Absolutely.
And the same mechanic can go for gold too.
That's true. But before we transition to gold, I want to go through XP. I bet you might have even been about to talk about that old PFS scenario where they were like, that's the price of honesty, and then you just lose a huge amount of gold if you don't rob the person that you were saving. But we'll get into it for gold. I want to transition while I talk about a few other ways to hand out XP that aren't as similar. And the last one will be the OSR / like older D&D way of XP equals gold. And then I think that could transition us into gold.
Sounds good to me.
So next one I want to talk about is we talked about, like, fights give different than and maybe more. We talked about, like, overcoming obstacles gives the same amount. There's some systems where getting XP or advancing your skills with whatever is the most similar to XP is only gained in a different way. For example, in the Burning Wheel style games, you can only advance your skills if you try and succeed at that skill and also try and fail at that skill a certain number of times. Now, that's a very different incentive than some of the ones we were talking about before for XP. The reason being is that, in general, many RPGs incentivize you to succeed because that makes you, like, keep going, and you don't get a yes but, and you don't get a negative drawback or some other thing.
And they also then encourage you to say, whoever is the best at XYZ should be the one who does XYZ. But if you can't get stronger unless people are doing things that are outside of their comfort zone, or they happen to get unlucky one time, then you're better off for the overall power of your group by having a variety of people try things.
That's right. It gives a lot more interest towards the idea that someone was trying something that was outside their wheelhouse, because then they're likely to fail that. And normally you might want to tell a story about times that people had to try things outside their wheelhouse, but then, like, the mechanics of the game are just like, well, this is just worse for no reason other than that we're trying to do this thing for the story, and it will mess us all up. Whereas in those kind of systems, you can be like, no, this character is very mad right now and is just gonna try to do this, and then you can't. So depending on how, that's an example that's more different than some of the other ones we're going to use on incentivizing growth through something similar to XP, and how it gives very different behaviors.
I also want to talk about the example of
oh, and there's a question.
Yes.
So I want to go into yours, but the question is, wait, did the thief need the paladin to fail the stealth to get XP? So no, the thief wants to get up stealth. They will need to succeed and fail at a certain number of stealths. And so basically the idea is that you learn as much from failure as from success, and if you're constantly going against noobs that you can always sneak past and you never ever fail, then you probably weren't doing anything that pushed yourself to test the limits of your stealth. And so in that case, it would be more that the paladin, who is constantly failing the stealth, who is being bad at it, easily gets the failures that is necessary. So if they can just get, like, a few successes, then they will quickly learn and advance their stealth. Whereas for the thief, they need to go up against a true challenge to their stealth and fail a few times. It also means that they will actually, if they have trouble failing because they are so good at it, they might actually be like, yes, finally, if they actually fail stealth
so
at
then
some
they
point.
can get better, yeah.
And then the follow-up from Chris, who asked that, was saying that learning from failure TTRPG is normally a painful lesson. That's true. And so that's why I've seen people talking about online that if you have a young player, especially because, young, like little kids don't like to fail in general,
Mm-hmm.
but and you're teaching them their first RPG, if you pick one with an incentive structure where like you need a certain number of successes and a certain number of failures to advance, and they're like, you need that, you can teach them that idea and the idea
Yeah.
that failure is part of the game and can even be good, and try to role play the failure in a way that's interesting. A lot of that have a fail forward type situation in Burning Wheel anyway, where it's like you still do it, but now you have this
Mm-hmm.
negative. And like Mouse Guard, that's based on Burning Wheel, is one that Linda has run
Yeah.
that works in
And
the same
honestly,
way.
in some ways, it's more realistic because you're not going to get better at things by only doing things that are easy for you. So when you're talking to kids about it, about like the process of learning and how failure is a part of learning, then it's good for that.
And if you move the kids into playing D&D or Pathfinder 2nd or something like that afterwards, they'll already have internalized that failure can be something that's interesting, that moves the game forward, and that is useful. Whereas if you start with a system where failure is just like, oh, bad, we just need to succeed and succeed as much as possible, then it teaches a different lesson. And that's all about incentives.
So I also wanted to talk about, speaking of learning and incentives, the World of Darkness games like Changeling and Mage and things like that, where you have, when you get experience points from sessions, one of the things you can get an experience point for is what did your character learn this time. So, I find that when playing other systems, I'm not thinking nearly as much about what my character learned, but when I'm playing that system, I'm very much thinking throughout the session about how is my character responding to these events? What is maybe challenging their beliefs? What are they going to learn about themselves and the world around them? And how are they going to adapt based on things? And then so I find that leads to much more dynamic characters, because literally every session you're thinking about what did my character learn this time.
That's right. And they all have a checklist in those, at least the World of Darkness 20th anniversary ones that Linda and I have done, have a checklist of like, what did you learn? Did you learn something? Or like, did you go up against harsh odds and grave danger? And were you like very heroic during this? And therefore each of those things on the checklist is an incentive, because you ideally want to do all the things on that incentive list. And so whatever you put on there, that's going to be your incentive. And so, for example, I had an NPC that was also advancing, and I changed one of her things because she was a character who was like hidden by a curse to be very difficult to detect, and she was like not allowed to reveal her true self to others. And so one of her experience point ticks was, did she appear in this adventure and nobody could tell? I would ask Linda, is like, hey, did you think you saw this character here? If so, who was it? And if Linda guessed correctly, then that character did not get the experience point.
And it turns out that character showed up a lot and was actually the same as a different character, and I had no idea, so she got a lot of XP.
Well, yes. Once she established that one persona that you did not know was her, and who was then appeared a whole bunch of times, then it was easy farming.
Yes. Because I thought that character was a normal human and not a changeling.
Nope. And so that is another good example of incentives from XP. So to transition into money, in older D&D type situations, your XP was entirely based on money. So before we talk about the incentives that money are even on their own, I want to talk about how the XP being entirely based on money is actually a different incentive than the money incentive in games, because that is going to incentivize you towards greyhawking the entire place, which is, there's a reason why it's called greyhawking.
So so that's like looting things down to like
the doorknobs and like the door handles and door frames of everything to get the last gold piece. It can potentially incentivize cheating the other players out of their money by stealing from them or hiding something that you found from the rest of the players, because it makes your character advance faster than them because you got more money. It obviously incentivizes being very miserly with money in the dungeon, because it's usually, in a lot of them, it's just like, how much money did you bring out of the dungeon? If you spend it, you don't lose XP. So it'd be like, if there's a thing in the dungeon that like costs money, or that would like give you money for one choice and something that isn't money for the other choice, you need to make like money based decisions when you're in the place where money is XP, and be like, of course we don't buy things from this dungeon shop that would make us not get experience points. If we did, we are gonna wait and buy when we do get the experience points.
Yeah.
So it really makes for a feeling where the money is more pressing, and in some ways you might think like more realistic towards someone who's desperate for money in real life. Even though money is valuable in all RPGs, more or less, except for ones that are like, well, there's nothing to buy with it. You can't buy magic items, so do whatever you want. Which is kind of more the 5e take on it, but in a lot of RPGs with a solid money economy, it is very valuable, and people do want to get more. But when it's also your literal only advancement, it leads towards like a major obsession towards money.
So that also reminds me of like 3.5 crafting and such, where you pour XP into your creation of things, and how like but one thing that was interesting to me about that is that because you got more XP if you were lower level, people who were behind would eventually catch up, so it wasn't like as much of a sting as it would have been like if you didn't eventually catch up. It didn't make you would be behind, but not like significantly and permanently. So it felt like you paid a cost, but not like it felt very different otherwise.
That's a good point. And actually, before I know I said I would transition with the XP as money, but that made me remember one more XP incentive thing that I wanted to talk about. Yeah. I'm gonna call it out because normally I don't call out mechanics, but it's one that I really personally do not like in my games. And the games that have it, I actually really like those games other than that. All the ones that I've ever played that have this, I think are great other than this one thing, which is XP as also a resource that you could either save up to level up, or you can spend and lose the XP to like re-roll something, or to get like some very ephemeral benefit right now in the game. So I find that to be one of the worst possible incentive structures that you can possibly put into your game, bar none. It just leads to so many problematic interactions between players and their advancement rates and the incentivization, because it's fine if everybody does the structure in roughly the same way, right? But like when I'm playing in a system like that, or any system, I'm a hoarder of resources. So basically, unless it's very clear to me that like I'm dead if I don't spend the point, I will definitely never spend the XP for any of the other things other than saving it up to level up. And some of those systems try to get around this by being like, well, if you see that someone's really behind, there's also whenever XP is given out that you get an extra one that the players can decide who to give it to, and we're gonna pressure you to give it to the person who's behind. And someone in chat said, did Mark just admit to being a loot goblin? I wouldn't say that I go around and loot everything and Greyhawk it. I'm generally okay to not do that. But once I get an item or an XP or some kind of resource, I would say I'm an inveterate like techer. If you're talking about like text versus rush in a real-time strategy game, like I will not do the thing where it's like my long term is ruined so I can get all these zerglings and do a zergling rush, and if it loses, I lose. I'll be more like I'm teching up to the later thing. I will always do the thing that is better in the long term, even if that's a problem, and I should have also gotten some things for the short term. Like, I'm the person who plays Civilization 2 and tries to make peace with everybody around me, and, I have, like, 3 Stone Age warriors in my towns, and then Kublai Khan betrays me and is just like, I'm attacking. I'm like, oh, you're attacking Kublai Khan? Alright, well, I guess I'll replace these 3 Stone Age warriors with Marines. Because I could have, I just didn't. because I was at peace with everybody and I was teching. And you think you're so fancy because you have horses and I have Stone Age warriors, but I have Marines now, and you're gone. So like that's sort of my style in general.
So,
I play the long game. That's
yeah.
it.
So this reminds me of another incentive that happens with the structure of items and the Mega Elixir problem.
Yes,
So,
I also have the Mega Elixir problem.
let's talk about the Mega Elixir problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say like one more time, when you have those XP that can be used as consumables, you can wind up with people who are multiple levels ahead of other people, and who just quickly get to the point where they're so far ahead that the other person who's behind needs to spend the XP as a consumable even more than they did before, because they haven't been leveling up, because they're the Timmy player who just wants to reroll and always wants to succeed.
Before we continue, though, we have a chat here. How do you feel about games that give a set amount of XP, like XP per hour of the session? Does that create bad incentives?
No, that can be fine.
It doesn't create bad incentives. It just means
too.
that XP is not serving the role of an incentive structure in your game. So
Correct.
other things are serving the role of the incentive structure in your game. So whatever.
It actually, there's always an incentive. So you're right that it almost isn't serving an incentive. And if it's milestone based, it sort of isn't. But the incentive that your XP is serving, if it's based on number of hours in your session, is filibuster.
Oh,
Your incentive is to filibuster. If it's like the villain in 3 in-game days is going to blow up the city, but is like 10 levels higher than us, then it'd be like, okay. So my just to use an example of something my little brother hated when one of our other players did in Shackled City, went to the GM and spent 3 in-game hours buying wine, and so it'd be like, all right, I'm gonna spend 3 in-game hours buying wine because we'll all level up while I'm buying the wine in the 3 in-game hours, which are presumably, or 3 out-of-game hours, which presumably is 3 in-game hours, because that's what we're doing. But if we just said we sleep for the night, then 12 hours passed and we didn't get any XP because we just said we sleep for the night.
You're totally right. I was thinking about what Rohit was just mentioning in chat, which is the more common one that we've seen, which is milestone leveling.
Yes, so milestone leveling, then in that case, the XP is incentivizing getting to the milestone efficiently and skipping as much as you can. Maybe it's not a strong incentive. In fact, these are both, as Linda was saying, they're milder incentives. They're not really that much of an incentive to do that, but they are slightly. And you can have gold as a counter incentive to that skip incentive for milestone.
Yeah, I think that's more what I meant, was that things like gold and allies and resources are more going to be the things that's driving how you do things. So you could try jumping straight to the final encounter so you make the milestone, but that might be really perilous because the encounters are going to be more dangerous, so there's a lower chance of success there. So then the incentive is to gather the resources that we can before we go and do this.
So, sorry, what was the thing you were going to move us into that wasn't the gold?
Yes. Mega Elixirs and incentives surrounding consumables.
Yes, that's a big one. So, obviously, with the advent of Dark Souls, the idea of consumables that are basically, actually, they tell you that they're an item, but they're basically a spells per day.
Mm-hmm.
They just kind of are. They're spells per day that come back when you rest, have become popular. And it's because of the fact they avoid what is called the Mega Elixir problem. Many of you may have heard about it. I am a living embodiment of this. This is when consumables are truly something that you can hoard up any number or up to 99 of or whatever, and then just kind of hoarding onto them for a rainy day, trying to find any solution to your problems that doesn't use them, and then eventually getting to the point where if it's not a Mega Elixir, which is a strong item from Final Fantasy, but is actually like a weaker potion, you get to the point where it's just like, this potion just doesn't heal enough that you would ever use it anymore.
So in the range where the item is most useful, you might not use it because you don't have very many of them. But then by the time that you get enough of them that you say, okay, yeah, I can safely use this, I'm not gonna run into an encounter later where it's too dangerous. You find yourself with your stack of 99 potions and you're selling them off in town so that you don't like overflow, or you're like using them for inefficient out of combat healing and you're like, darn, I wish I'd used them earlier when they were useful, but then I didn't know back then that I wasn't potentially going to run out.
Exactly. And so I wrote the gardens system in Treasure Vault specifically for players like me that have this issue, and that if you give them something every day, they're much more likely to use it because they use it or lose it. This is also the reason why hero points in Pathfinder Second Edition are not a type of point that you hoard between sessions like some other meta points, but instead are also use it or lose it during the real world session.
And very similarly to Gardens, the system in Pathfinder Society of getting a free consumable at the beginning of each adventure was intended to be like, okay, well, to incentivize trying out the consumables because it is a use it or lose it type situation.
Exactly.
As well as to help with the default being, oh, you get like a healing potion or whatever, as well as to help with like potential survivability with new players or folks who are playing with a group that's never played together before. They haven't gotten a chance to grok each other's strategy, but they are higher levels, so they're facing greater challenges.
That's right. Rohit says they still end up losing hero points. I do sometimes too, but very, very often what I wind up doing is near the end of the session, or when I gauge that I probably won't fail another roll this session, I use it for a reroll. And otherwise I hoard it in case I'm dying and I need to not die. That is what I do with hero points like every time. But because of that, and because they wear off at the end of the session, I think I actually have used my hero points, especially in our Monday games that are shorter, and I still get 1 hero point in them. I use it in those Monday games like over half the time, at least. Probably more like 2/3.
Because we know those games, they're probably going to have 1 combat because they're shorter, so...
And of the 1/3 where I don't use it, legitimately some of those times there's just like literally not a place that anyone could have used it because it's a shorter session where it's just like, well, I didn't fail any checks, or if I did, it was completely irrelevant because like it was one where we were trying to get victory points and everybody already had enough victory points anyway, so I couldn't have re-rolled. I didn't go down, so I couldn't have saved my life, and it was like there just wasn't anything that I could have used it at, and that's fine. And I don't feel bad about not using it when I couldn't have used it.
So Chris Abbott here is talking about garden system sounds interesting. Could some side quests be to find seeds or sprouts of various plants to increase the combinations of ingredients available?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like quests to increase resources are incentivize people like going out and being creative and thinking about the options that they have available.
Yeah. And
that's great for encouraging more of a sandboxy feel to your game.
Yeah, and while gold is like listed there as the way to upgrade the garden, and I based it off of like the idea of, in some ways, of wands, which are a once per day spell, when I was getting some of the price structure for it, you absolutely could consider a Pathfinder 2 where you make gardens like more of a fundamental thing, like a party level up resource where like you level up your garden with rare fertilizers and ingredients that you find, almost like in some like video games that have that Estus Flask style item resource where getting more items and then deciding what your items are both upgrades that you can give. Like, you could consider making gardens much more of an in-depth thing than is in Treasure Vault, where it's just like, yeah, no, the party has a garden, and it has X number of slots. Instead of normally with the garden, it's just like each time you build another section, it makes that item. So it has X number of slots, which you can choose what they are. And then maybe, like, there's a high-level upgrade that is just like an any slot, where it's just like, you just take something from the garden, and then later you decide which of the things the garden could have produced that is, and you do it kind of retroactively.
Yeah, and so in that case, you could take some of the party's treasure budget and apply it toward upgrades for the gardens, and then you kind of replace the dropping of like arbitrary consumables with this ability to have this continually renewing resource.
Absolutely.
Or you don't, and you have more consumables in your game.
Yep. So that's our consumable digression. So now we really will, because we did XP as money, talk about money as an incentive. So in many RPGs, money is a major incentive. Especially in ones like Pathfinder 2, where there is a magic item economy, even if it's not always the case that you can get literally any item that you want in any settlement that you want. There is a way to exchange gold for magic items that goes up to a pretty high amount of money. That is the case in many games that drop lots of money. That there's at least some kind of better gear that you can get if you use that gold.
And generally, the amount of gold that you gain from things will escalate throughout the game, and then the things that you can, and so that there are steadily more powerful things that require you to have large amounts of gold. Sometimes they might have hypothetically been around the whole time and you just couldn't afford them. Like, you know, if you're in Pathfinder and you're in the city of Absalom, yeah, sure, there's high level stuff around there, but if your character's level 1, they're not gonna have like a cart full of thousands and thousands of gold that they can use to pay for that stuff.
Yeah,
or other times your game might have something where, you know, the area that the players start in or assume to start in is an area that has less powerful stuff, and they need to go on a certain quest to find different things that are different types of technology. I think it also depends on like how much more powerful the equipment is versus like how much more versatile it is.
So there's some games that just hand wave away money. There are others like 5e where you get it, but then after a very early point, there's really nothing you're gonna get from money other than role play stuff. Like be like, well, I guess maybe I'm gonna build a castle with this eventually, or something that is not upgrading your character. It still has a magic item system that gets stronger and stronger, but those are said to be optional even though everybody uses them, and the GM kind of just figures that part out with incentives in a way that is less liquid because you can't really trade back and forth for gold. So the liquidity is lower. The progression is like similar, but also a little more obscured in that regard. And there are some systems where there just isn't an itemization that can make you stronger, period. And money is entirely about lifestyle choices for your characters.
Or about certain options that are available to them. Like, you know, do you have the ability to rent out this building for this particular scheme that you have? You know, do you have the ability to sustain... If you're going on these kinds of adventures, you know, like, are you going to have the upkeep to handle your barony, or are you going to go broke? Like, those sorts of things can come up where it's not, you know, it's not a magic item necessarily, or if you get magical things, they're more about, like, doing quests to acquire them, and they're not something that you can go down to, like, your local magic mart and purchase because they're personal, or they're very valued and treasured by the people who have them.
So Rohit wonders, is it correct to say certain progression of gold is required for game balance in 2E? So when I was building the curve for the money in Pathfinder 2E, I tried to make it as resilient as possible because it's so hard to give exactly the amount of money that it says on the suggested table, and sometimes people don't go everywhere, and so adventure paths put in more than that in case you miss some, and then some people get all of it, and it's not good if it gets thrown off by a small factor. So as you can see, if you go to battlezoo.com and get the free Battlezoo Otherworlders PDF, which has a bunch of like cheats that I grade on a scale from like an E rank cheat that is just like basically not helping you almost at all, to like double S where it just breaks the game entirely. I consider a pretty substantial amount of bonus money that you get to not be that high of a level of cheat in that system where I rated the cheats. And that's because of the fact that giving bonus money the game is meant to be resilient to that, assuming that you don't also let them buy items that are much higher level than them.
Yeah.
However, if you don't use automatic bonus progression and you make them paupers that are way below, you can wind up making it so that the PCs are a little bit weaker than they should have been and should be fighting monsters that are lower level.
When you consider it numerically, there's some gap between like the level where a +1 goes into a +2. So like unless you're in terms of the level, so like unless you're letting them buy items that are like 4 levels higher than their level, they're not going to be numerically ahead of the curve directly from doing that, so much as they could be if they were way below. It could be like, oh, you know, the game kind of expects that everybody's got a striking weapon by now, but nobody's got a striking weapon.
It's like we're level 20, I gave them 0 and no magic items, and the game expects that they have a major striking weapon, and they do not. They have a stick. They didn't even have a great sword because a stick was free. and I give them 0. And it'd be like, we thought you had a great sword that did 4d12 plus like 3d6 from property runes. You had a stick that did a d6. This is going to be an issue.
Yes.
So at some point there is an amount that is low enough that it will break the game. I mean, it's not broken, but they are worth multiple levels lower. And at some point, there's an amount that is high enough that they can just buy like thousands of on-level consumables and have like thousands of the maximum spell level of their level, even if you don't let them get higher level items.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, okay, sure, we're just gonna throw out the most powerful spell possible every round, and every character has thaumaturge dedication and scroll feat so that we can all do that, whether we're the fighter or not.
But I'd say, realistically in your home game, if you check like every level or so and make sure, hey, are there kind of standard items that, okay, it's a couple levels past when folks would have gotten the striking rune. Does everybody have or one level past, does everyone have a striking rune by this point? Or like, if not, there's someone who doesn't really need one based on their build. Does everybody have like the +1 resilient armor? Like, because people aren't going to have those things like necessarily immediately. You hit the level, the party doesn't have like everyone immediately has that thing. But if you're noticing that there are certain like things in kind of that core or numerical boosty thing that people don't have, and that like folks who don't need that don't have like a comparable amount of other stuff. Like, okay, yeah, sure, you're a wizard, you don't need a yada yada striking weapon, but does your wizard have like a wand or some other thing that's around that level?
Right.
Because you could also have a party where folks then prioritize the things that are like, I need the number bonus, and then you notice things get very lopsided in terms of, hey,
if you gave literally 0 gold, the wizard in particular would be one of the least affected at level 20 with 0 gold. They're still not happy.
Yeah, no, they are one of the least affected. So what I'm saying is that, like, when at least as I've seen in times when the party tends to be a little bit lighter on resources, they first prioritize, like, okay, does the fighter have a great weapon? And then, like the wizard or the cleric, it's more like, okay, yeah, we don't necessarily need to get your widget right now because we want to get the healer's gloves for the medicine bonus. So as long as everybody's getting stuff, and you catch up to that expectation within a level or two.
So Rohit says, do you think it would work if the GM removes all gold from Pathfinder 2 and hands out level appropriate items? So I've gone through a lot of scenarios for removing all gold, and there are a lot of things that would work. You could remove all gold and use automatic bonus progression with a few other extras because it doesn't cover literally everything that people are going to want, and that can make a big difference for your players, but it almost does, and not even notice it if you make the correct few other extras. It'll make a difference, but it won't be enough that it will weaken the PC substantially, except against maybe extreme or very nasty severe encounters where they needed to pull out all the stops.
I could see something too where like you're like, okay, we don't give gold, but we do some things that are gold equivalent, like, instead of giving the wizard a wand, we give the wizard, like, they got an infusion of arcane power that kind of
gives them an extra spell.
And it
has to be
fireball or whatever, and then
it's a 3rd level fireball or whatever, or maybe something that's more evergreen. So it'd be like, it gives a 3rd level fear every day.
Yeah.
You can do that. You can do monster parts from Battle Zoo Bestiary, where you give out monster parts and use that, which kind of function. They have a GP value, but they really function more like XP for your items, and your items then level up and gain new abilities when you put the monster parts into them. You can do what you suggested literally, which is be like, okay, I see what items it says to give, and I see how much extra gold it says to give, but I'm going to take out that extra gold and replace it with more items that are of a roughly equivalent value. That's fine too, assuming that you're not like, I say it's fine, and it probably is. But if you're like, well, I will twirl my mustache. Mark has given me permission to get rid of all the liquid money and the ability to sell things, and I can put in whatever items I want as long as I have the appropriate levels. So we've got a cleric and a wizard and a fighter and a rogue. So I'll put this occultism item that gives bonuses on occult magic as the big item that we're gonna put in. And the fighter likes to use a great sword. So I'm gonna use this specific weapon bow. Yeah. It's a specific weapon, so they can't transfer the runes off. Although since they have 0 gold, they already can't transfer the runes because it costs 10% of the cost to do so. And additionally, we're playing before remaster, and we have a druid, so I'm gonna give this primal spellcasting metal armor that is a metal armor that makes you better at primal spellcasting to the party, and they can't sell it, and it's a very high level item.
So in realistic terms, when you're handing out items, they're the kind of things that your players would want and are excited by, and that fit with sort of their fighting style and their play style and the kinds of skills that they like being good at. Then yeah, it can totally work.
Oh no, Script is taking notes of the bad item ideas to give to their players. Uh-oh. There we go.
Yes.
So, when we're talking about money and incentives, I want to go back. I'm going to circle back. So we were talking about, Baldur's Gate 3, computer RPGs, Planescape Torment, some of the other ones that give XP, and it gave supposedly like 2/3 of the XP for killing from the completely peaceful solution, which I would like to give all the XP, but that's still a good percentage. Mm-hmm. But even if it gave all the XP, when we were in this Roll for Combat episode, we were talking about Baldur's Gate 3, the thing Steven said was, it didn't give any of the money, though, that you would have gotten from killing and looting people. Yeah. And so sometimes gold can be the thing that's the murder hobo incentive. Even in Pathfinder 2, assuming that you're not exercising your rights to the very first rule of the game, where you just say, screw it, I'm going to do whatever I want, and I choose to not give XP for this peaceful solution because I love murder. But if you follow the actual rules of the game, you have to give the XP for the peaceful solution. But you don't have to give money. You're not forced to find another way to get that money. Pathfinder Society does it.
Yeah, so Pathfinder Society has a structure and Starfinder Society does as well, where you get XP, so you get treasure based on the challenges that you've overcome, however you overcome them, so whether it was combat or non-combat. And that represents the idea that the societies are rewarding the characters based on their success. And so, if they didn't like kill the person and loot their stuff, then the societies are like, you went with a less violent solution. That's going to be better for our long-term thing. Here's your money for your mission. So they'll give you more, and then it works out to be the same amount.
And when I was designing the monster parts system, you would think, well, you're literally Monster Hunter, like getting the parts out of the big monster. It's a pretty violent solution, right? It would really incentivize you. You have to kill everything. But I specifically put in there talking about the stories that you hear in fiction, and that has been actually a big part even from older editions of D&D, where it would be like, for this ritual, you need a feather from an angel, freely given. Mm-hmm. They would put like comma freely given in the old D&D descriptions of things. So I was said that when you get a monster part that was gifted to you by a monster because of a debt or just a bond of friendship or something like that, it can be infused with more energy, and it gives more of the XP equivalent value to your items when you use that part. The one from this angel who is now your friend, or from, like, in Shattered Star, there's a Coatl you can help, and they give you a feather. It's like, this feather can allow you to call on me at any time. So if I was doing that with monster parts, I would also be like, there is a second feather that doesn't call on the Coatl that's also imbued with your friendship, and that like is a monster part that's equal to if you had killed the Coatl who was under a mind compulsion that you saved them from. And all the parts together only had the same value as that one feather because it was so metaphysically important. And that's a way, even in a monster part system, that you can give it, that you can give an alternative reward so that you're not gold piece incentivizing murder. Mm-hmm. So Rohit had a really interesting and longer question here. Yeah. Said, it seems to me non-combat solutions are less straightforward, and when players don't want to think too much, they may default to combat. Non-combat solutions frustrate some players, so in their session, one player got so frustrated they had to go out of their way to just murder a bunch of goblins to placate him. how would you make non-combat solutions more interesting and less convoluted?
I think it depends upon the circumstance, because sometimes when, sometimes the combat solution is definitely going to be the more straightforward. Like, for example, the PCs are going into an area and the people who are in that area, or the creatures who are in that area, like, have a reason to default toward being hostile to them. And in other cases, in other cases, it's not necessarily as complicated. So I wonder, like, what. I'm wondering, like, when you're talking about, like, non-combat solutions, are you talking about things like stuff that uses an influence subsystem stuff, or are you talking more about
Or I think
the
just
idea of, like,
anything
coming
other
up
than
with-
violence.
Yeah, the idea of coming up with like a plan, coming up with a common ground, and, like, negotiating and stuff like that.
So I think there's a few main tips that I would give for designing incentives specifically to incentivize a non-combat solution.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start with tip number 1, which is, if you especially are trying to, like, I guess, rehabilitate a player or group that has gotten burned in the past with non-combat solutions and tries combat solutions, then do not be tempted with the idea of, well, it would make sense for this person to betray them later on.
Yeah, don't do that.
So don't do that. So I'll give an example of where I didn't do that, and it kind of subverted expectations in some ways. So the group in my Jade Regent game really liked this chaotic evil harpy oracle of Pazuzu. They just liked her, and they recruited her onto their caravan. And so they had this evil oracle of Pazuzu. They kept trying to convince her to not be evil and not worship Pazuzu. They didn't succeed very well. She just gave long, like, philosophical discussions about how the supposedly good people are just massacring. They're the same, but the chaotic evil are more honest about it. And eventually, Linda's character stopped trying to argue after Linda's character actually invoked Pazuzu to try to help defeat undead, because she hated undead so much, and was like, I've lost the moral ground. I'm not going to try to convince this oracle. So there was a time when it was fairly obvious that the evil Oni Empire the PCs were trying to overthrow were going to try to get a mole in the party, and they were going to try to infiltrate, and they probably tried to contact this chaotic evil harpy. It would have been easy to have the chaotic evil harpy betray them, because, like, that's something a chaotic evil harpy would do. But what actually wound up happening that the PCs didn't find out until later is that the Onis who had been doing really well at ambushing and doing clandestine ops got messed up, and then the PCs found out that they had approached the harpy, who told the Onis that she would betray the party for them, and then lied to the Onis and betrayed the Onis to screw them up to the party. And then they're like, well, we thought you would have betrayed us because the Onis are, like, much stronger and they're ruling here and they're lawful, and they probably would have kept their word that they would have given you stuff. Like, we know you don't trust good aligned people to actually do what you said.
So why didn't you stab us in the back?
Why didn't you stab us in the back? And she said, the Onis didn't promise me an entire prefecture. And you promised me an entire prefecture, and you've talked to me enough times about staying with your word and not being chaotic evil that I think that all of you are not such massive hypocrites. And I think it would be funny for you to have to deal with the fact that you've given me an entire prefecture, and I'm going to do whatever I want there. So, yeah, I just thought it was more interesting than siding with the Onis. And so that's just what she did. So because it would have been easy, it probably might have made more sense in some ways to have her betray them, but I think also she refused to say it, but that she did actually like them somewhat at that point, and she just didn't want to admit that part.
Yes.
But she was a greedy harpy who, like, she always demanded 2 shares of the treasure, and the party gave it to her when she demanded it, and she was just like, no, you guys have kept your word to me, and you promised me something really good, so I'm going to stick with you this time. So that's my first tip towards designing incentives toward non-violent solutions.
That makes me think of another tip as well, which is somewhat related to this, which is the idea of having non-violent solutions lead to more interesting outcomes. So,
Yes.
for example,
That was going to be my second tip.
yeah. So, for example, if a non-violent solution means that you have an enduring ally that you can work with, or a recurring NPC who like gives you more quests, or like someone who speaks on the party's behalf later on and opens doors, and then it shows the players, hey, this non-violent solution meant that we got this additional thing, or the stealth, because I see the comment, it could be anything other than violence, could be stealth, could be negotiation. Pointing out, how stealthing, if you have situations where going in and Leroy Jenkinsing and just charging in and attacking everything means that like lots of encounters pile up and it gets more dangerous. Whereas when you choose the more subtle solution, when you stealth past something, you're able to get an advantage in the combat. I think calling attention to when those other solutions give more rewards makes them more valuable. Just like, calling attention to when the bonus from Inspire Courage from the Bard means that someone hits when they otherwise would have missed. It makes that feel more rewarding.
So Linda circled back from the positives into the negatives and has now given both halves of my second tip for this, which is focus on the other consequences of both types of actions, violent and non-violent. So exactly like Linda said, show something good that happened from their non-violent solution that obviously wouldn't have happened from the violent solution, through a recurring character, through something that they do, through like a piece of information they give you if you want to do it right then, so that you reinforce the behavior at the time instead of like a delay, and they may not like associate it as much with the non-violent solution. Similarly, show negative consequences when you Leroy Jenkins in and the entire the entire place gets alerted. Maybe when you get to the end, like depending on what motivates them, right? Maybe the villain escaped with some of the treasure because they had so much advanced notice because the PCs were trying to do a stealth tactic, but one person ran in and just shouted Leroy Jenkins right at the front guards, and it gave so much time that happened.
And they're going to need to track down the villain again before they can get the rest of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or maybe like later on, after they killed that group of goblins, and they go in later and they find another group of goblins who are friendly, and then that know a lot about what's going on, and they're like, yeah, but the pieces are like, yeah, but we really need to go know about the mystical statue of a MacGuffinor that we were looking for. It's like, well, Bob knew about that. He was in the Western Tunnels. They're like, oh, we killed everyone in the Western Tunnels.
Yeah. So having people be like more or less likely to trust the PCs, looking at their reputation. Also, I think that this gets it. So we're getting at sort of like, how do you incentivize it? Another thing that I sometimes see is with players wanting to go with the combat solution more often when they feel like they just want to fight, they want to do combat, and they haven't had a good opportunity to do it.
Sometimes there's no problem with that.
It's like, you've had a lot of situations that are more convoluted or like morally gray for a bit. That's a good sign that it's time to run an adventure where you have your evil necromancer and their horde of zombies, and they're terrorizing the town, and there's no moral ambiguity, and the right solution is just to punch your way through.
Correct. We have begged the question that we definitely want to get the person who likes fights to do the non-combat solution, which if they only ever fight, you probably do. But if the answer is, like Linda said, that, so every encounter in the last 20 encounters, the team up of the Bard and the Redeemer have gone over and like been like, no, we have redeemed this demonic snake undead into and now it runs a children's museum. And that happened for 20 fights in a row. And then the other person is like, I'm playing a berserker whose soul slips away every day that I don't kill someone, and I will die in 100 days if I don't. And that's my character because I like fighting. Why have we not done any fighting in the last 20 encounters? Like, that's a situation where the pendulum has swung one way, and you should give them some combat encounter. Maybe next time the demonic snake undead is also mindless, and they can't convince it to run a children's museum. They do have to fight it.
Yeah. And I think this happens too with overall encounter complexity and varying that up. Like, it's awesome sometimes to have encounters where you're like, we've got the complex hazard running and like the room is flooding and there's all these things going on and it's big and epic.
And the bard is like, wait, while the room may be flooding, I'd like to talk to this piranha fish in here using speak with animals and see if the piranha fish would want to convert to Shellen.
Yes, but like, while it's awesome to have that kind of stuff, sometimes if you constantly have things that are complicated, then like people get tired of it, and you want to vary it up with, just like you want easier encounters and harder encounters, you want more complex encounters and simpler encounters, and you can do the same thing for non-combat solutions too. So when you're talking about making them less convoluted, I'm also thinking about like how you can present those non-combat solutions to make them take like less cognitive load on your players. It's just like, you know what, I'm tired, like I just want to hang out with my friends and I want to play, and I don't want to like have this complex negotiation scene where we have to think about things back and forth, or like I don't want to spend like half an hour strategically talking about how we can most optimally infiltrate this base. I would say that you, as the GM, depending upon what your group prefers, can go towards suggesting some potential approaches, and it's like, and help focus the conversation. So it's like, are you looking for something that's more of a like charge in the front or like a sneak in the back door solution, so that the players then are not needing to present as much of their plan up front.
Also, while the infiltration subsystem is more complicated than just like a narrative system where you like roll one thing and then describe, it is probably simpler than having to like plan out everything and do it round by round in regular exploration mode, to use something like the infiltration subsystem to build up infiltration points. And
I'd say also like doing something where you don't want to have gotchas, right? Where like your players feel like they have to spend a long time scheming, because if they didn't happen to mention beforehand that they
took the clothes off of this one NPC the enemies may be able to locate object on the clothes.
That was an oddly specific
That actually literally happened to us in
in
Hell's Rebels, where the GM was like, when you unpetrified this person that the enemies captured, you didn't change her outfit, and the enemies used locate object on it.
So then, like, if you have some degree to which you can be like, yeah, okay, yeah, and they're like, oh yeah, we would have, it's like, I think we probably should have brought a rope. Crud, I forgot to say we brought a rope. Be like, yeah, you usually carry a rope. You have a rope. It's fine. So they don't have to like think about that so much in advance, and they don't feel like it's an adversarial situation.
Yep.
Obviously, if they're like, oh yes, we totally brought like thermite to this particular thing because we knew we were going to run into like a door that could only be dissolved by thermite because it was immune to fire magic. Like, there's a certain degree to which it's like, all right, yeah, there's no reasonable way your character would have known about this particular circumstance. Right. Another thing that's used, speaking of knowing about things, recall knowledge is a very powerful way to give information to your players about key things to help focus them on ways that they can solve things. Also, when it comes to negotiation, like, some players are going to be more into like all of the very specific details of what they offer and what gets the counteroffer, and some are going to be more interested in just saying, you know what, I'm generally going to do this kind of strategy, and then I roll a diplomacy check, and that's totally fine too. And then you can help to flesh in some of the details. Then it's like, oh yeah, with because they say, we want to try to negotiate with them. We want to try to offer to trade some of the resources that we have for knowledge that they have. And then, they roll really high, and it's like, oh yeah, with your high diplomacy, you realize that they are, I'm not squirreling. You just sent a squirreling.
We're squirreling, but it is a question that was asked that was vaguely related to the topic.
Yeah, that's true. Fair enough. But I answered a question from chat. But, that we, you realize with your high diplomacy and talking to them that they were really interested in the herbs that your druid has been, the medicinal herbs that your druid has been collecting. And so you worked out a favorable deal where, like, this thing. And then like, the players can say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or like, no, we actually really liked our medicinal herbs. And then we're like, all right, so like, what other things would you have been fine with trading? So then you are able to set a you're able to then work out a way that works that doesn't put the player as much on the spot to figure things out. So
that's right.
I
so
approach this
to
question
move back
from a few
to
different
move back to incentives, the last type of incentive that I want to be sure that we cover today, because they're in a lot of different systems, and there are systems out there that have incentives that are pretty different from any of these, but I'm going to talk about meta incentives. They're usually some kind of point with a very very impressive sounding name, like hero points or fate points, or any of those kind of points, meta points that can be used by players to do something during the game. And those points are another type of incentive that can incentivize a variety of different behaviors, and they are about as disparate as you will find compared to like money and XP. There's only so many different ways that systems give those out, but these special points, totally different. So in many systems that have these points, one of the ways to get the points is to just impress the GM, or do something that makes the entire table laugh, or that makes everyone excited, and that was awesome. So that incentivizes the kind of play style that gets people excited at the table and revs people up. It incentivizes often witty or extroverted players to get more benefits in the session. And generally, because it's done at discretion, it's good for table morale. But it is true that certain players may be able to get it way more often if there's some players who just click with the GM, or if the table decides they click with enough other people at the table.
Another thing you can have is ones for sort of playing to type, having your character do things that are
especially if it's bad for your character.
Yes.
But so some systems it's just always playing to type gives it to you, but some of them it's when you stuck with your thing even though you knew it wasn't good. And in Fate they have things called compels, where the GM is this aspect of you compels you to do this, unless you and if you do, you gain a point, and if you don't want to do it, you have to spend a point to stop it, and that means if you have no points, you're forced to do it.
Yes.
So that's an example where it goes in the other direction, and the GM is able to influence the players, whereas often these points allow the players to influence the GM. So another way that these points can incentivize things is failure. Not just XP in Burning Wheel, but in some systems, something really bad happening. Like in Cortex, if you fail, if you roll a 1 and get a complication, you also get a point. And in in Mutants and Masterminds, you can if something really bad happens, you can get a point from that. In some systems, the bad guys it's like a give and a take, like a tug of war, where players using points gives the villains points, and villains using points gives the players points, and it ping-pongs the points back and forth. All of these kind of bad things happening leads to getting points are kind of a anti-spiral of death mechanic.
Yes.
They incentivize the game being less swingy and trending more towards the mean.
Yes, because when you're doing excellently, you're not going to get as many points to influence things, and then when the more dire things get, the more points you have to help swing things back in your favor.
Exactly. And so, in Fabula Ultima, which is one that my little brother got at Gen Con that we've been playing recently, pretty much all of the ways that you get Fabula points, other than if you start the session with 0, you get 1, and they are hoarded. But you need to use them to get XP, so you can't hoard them forever. Are all from if you go to 0 in the encounter and something terrible happens to you, you get 2.
Yeah.
Which happened to Linda twice.
That's true.
Or if if the villain appears on the scene, then you get 1. And if you critically fail and something terrible happens, you get 1. So it's always generally a sort of anti-spiral of death, to give back, and to make it so those failures are also giving something interesting. Since those points become XP, they're essentially giving you XP down the line too.
Yeah. I think another one that we didn't directly talk about, we talked about XP and character power, but there are also other systems that give characters powers in ways that aren't directly tied to XP, and that those kinds of incentives work similarly to XP incentives in terms of
these
like,
meta incentives.
Yeah.
They absolutely do. And they work all incentives essentially work similarly once they've been in a common incentive, but they lead to different things, and it all depends on how you earn them. Right? You could imagine an RPG. I think this would be bad. And sorry if there is RPG like this. I'm not dissing on you. I actually can't think of one right now. You could imagine an RPG where you're like, you know what's heroic and earns a hero point? Critical success.
Yeah.
Because that was when you really did something amazing. You like pinned the Terrask down with Titan Wrestler, and you got a natural 20, which you needed because it was so hard otherwise, and you restrained it. But that is actually like not a very good game design incentive because it's rich get richer, and it's incentivizing just winning more when you're already winning and not doing better when you're actually already losing, for instance. And Pathfinder 2 kind of allows a GM to make that decision because the GM gets to decide what's worth a hero point, and they sometimes, I have seen GMs be like, wow, that thing you did on that critical success really seemed cool. That person gets a hero point. So, the system doesn't say you have to. So I would say if the system forces you to give, or at least tells the GM to give it to people who are getting the big successes, then that's not necessarily a great thing. Whereas helping people catch up or get back is usually good. It's not right for every system, but it's good in a way that by default, rich get richer is usually not.
Yes.
All right. So, do you have anything else to say about meta currencies like fate points, hero points,
no, I think
Fabula points?
Yes, I think that's pretty solid on those.
All right. So I think that's the last kind of incentive I definitely wanted to make sure we talked about here today. Let's see. Turgum NVT says, I like to give a good plan that failed by a dice, a hero point that must be cashed out. So basically like getting advantage.
So that's
absolutely. Absolutely. Where it was like, yeah, this was a good plan.
But it didn't work out because of the dice, but
so here's a hero point.
You tried something awesome.
And you have to use it now. And give you another chance. That's totally a good way to do it. And you can have control over it. The benefit of giving the GM control, like in PF2... Oh yeah, that's the last thing I want to say. Giving the GM control, which PF2 kind of does, has many benefits because it allows you to fine-tune what you want to incentivize. That sort of lets you be a bit of a game designer. But it has many detriments, which is that the GM might forget to give it out if it's not very mechanistic. And it's not like, no, I have to give it out at this particular time. They might just, oh, well, I forget to give them out. I'm terrible. I do never give them out at the correct rate because of the fact that, like, I guess I'm not impressed by enough things as much as I should be, and I'm not thinking about it because I'm thinking about other things, and I just don't give them out as much as I should.
So it usually turns out more that we're like, oh, we're in trouble. Hey, Mark, we haven't had hero points in a while.
And then I think back, and I was like, that thing was worth a hero point, and this thing was worth a hero point, and this one, yeah.
So, like, when we actually need them, we'll get them, but it's usually like, hey, Mark, hero points.
You're right. That makes me feel better about it. It's like just-in-time evaluation of for computer science, where I just didn't bother with it until now, but that's not what I'm doing on purpose. I'm just bad at handing it out. That is a weakness. Whereas if you have a system like Fabula Ultima, where it's like, I have no discretion on Fabula points unless I feel like just doing it on my own. The game just literally says when to give it. It's very easy to tell when the triggers for it happen because it's a critical failure or someone reaching 0 or a villain appearing.
Yeah.
That's it. So that is much easier to run. So you have to balance those two things, the flexibility versus the amount that people will forget to do it. And that can be very tricky and that can be very important. So, that's my last thing on designing incentives. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube then go into our final section?
Bye YouTube! Thanks for joining us today.